Hello and welcome to the Wolf Den podcast. I'm your host Nako, joined by my co-host Anitsu, and today we'll be talking about deck construction in the EX2 meta and what it means when you select certain cards to be added to your lists. So, the easiest place to begin is a common point of contention amongst the player base right now of whether you should be playing yellow or black D Reaper as your splash. Um, Zenitsu, what's your take on the situation?
I am 110% for black. I think the tech and tools that black has versus yellow just give it a lot more flexibility on how you could approach how you're going to actually be utilizing your cards. So, like, obviously, the big one is going to be TK or TK and Izzy as your tamers. So, what D Reapers is doing is it's not really interacting with the opponent's field a whole lot, so they're just gonna have Digimon usually. So that makes TK and Izzy a really easy card to just gain lots of memory from. And then Izzy, even though it has a very, very, very small chance of success, the fact that you could rake the top cards of your deck, especially in a deck where you're going to be drawing off of your searchers and you're trying to like dig for specific tools, that's a very good card to help set up and line up what you need for virtually any stage of the game. So I think just the tamer quality is there to support it. Uh, Easily the most commonly used option is going to be Final Zubagon Punch because the more common way you're going to be using it is one of two ways. You're going to be using it either A on Mother D to make it so she is an 18k blocker, which is just good enough to wall out most decks for a turn. So it's still buying you that extra turn to be able to make your Reaper play, or you're going to be using it on Reaper or some other D Reaper to be able to deal extra damage, and then it also just so happens to have reboot and blocker sometimes, depending on the card that you're utilizing it on. But Black has other really good options too, like Breath of the Gods, to just give something reboot so that way it doesn't die because a lot of the cards do suspend themselves, and then in security, it could just shut off aggro, period. Which again is good for buying you some time to set up and line up your combo easier and more efficiently. And then you have removal options. Well, they're just removal options. I think the more popular one is Ultimate Flare, just because Final Zoop Down Punch could whiff in the mirror, and Ultimate Flare kind of doesn't.
So, that was a pretty good overview of at least like the black package. Um, what I wanted to do today was to go over more so why, and not necessarily just with D Reaper, but a lot of stuff is applicable beyond D Reaper. It's just easier to use D Reaper as the example because it's the newest one. So you went over, I guess, step one. Um, I don't know how in depth we went into it in the past as far as D Reaper deck construction. So the D Reaper package is fairly self-explanatory, um, except for there are only a couple D Reapers that you don't want to be playing more four ofs, and some people run some amount of them. I've done some experimentation with myself on them, especially given the errata for optimizer. But uh, basically, I found through my testing at least that Creep Hands, the blocker, uh, Horn Striker, the rusher, and optimizer that if your D Reaper has 5 or more sources on play or when attacking, reveal top 3, playing a card with D Reaper that has a play cost of 10 or less, so anything optimizer and below, you can't play Reapers with it and you cannot play Gatekeepers with it, and then place the remaining cards at the top of your deck, kind of pseudo fixing your next draws the same way that Izzy does. Um, uh, I guess I'll get it out of the way. I'm still Camp Black. I had initially built it yellow, um, with the idea to borrow from whatever power that existed before the restriction of reinforced memory boost. But as anyone that isn't aware, at least, reinforced memory boost was restricted because of D Reapers abusing it in their yellow package. So
I
yeah,
also think that card is just insanely good. It
it's
like
just very efficient.
yellows. Yellow's card quality is just absolutely insane. Like the fact that Health Scythe, as an example, is a 3 for 1 is absolutely mind-boggling. And a lot of yellow cards basically do stuff like that, where it like easily goes 2 for 1 or 3 for 1. Um, but regardless, like yellow is still a really good color, but I do think black is going to be a more general favored one because in my perspective, you're only playing yellow A because you're trying to abuse Spiral Masquerade as the big removal card, which sometimes they could control the board and then you're just sitting on a not really dead card because Mother D is just gonna always make that card live, but it's just sometimes not that great, and then you're just trying to play gatekeeper, and that is the deck. You're just trying to use recovery cards and gatekeeper and bubbles to accelerate your game plan, and sometimes that just doesn't happen because you're still kind of luck sacking in security, which
Hmm.
is hit and miss.
Zenitsu and I did a decent amount of playtesting yesterday. I played D Reapers for most of it. Um, and we did find some more. We really delved into why certain cards are good. And um, so the black package, as Zenitsu mentioned, includes the Izzy Tamer, sometimes the Izzy and Joe Tamer, um, Ultimate Flare, or um, what was it?
Final Zubagon.
Well, Zubagon, yeah, but I'm trying to think of the other black removal card I've seen people use. Zubagon or Iron Fisted Onslaught as your removal sources. Um, and then your like stall slash tempo. I would say honestly, as far as this deck's concerned, they're fairly tempo plays of which are Final Zubagon Punch and Breath of the Gods, but they don't all have the same usages. And one of the things that I went back and forth on over the course of last evening was which copies I was playing, how many of each I was playing. Was I playing enough of removal and enough of stall, too much removal, not enough stall, and just really going back and because at least my goal of my D Reaper deck construction is that I'm playing around getting to 7 sources underneath Mother so that I could play Reaper for free. Um, but that's kind of it. That's the ceiling as far as I'm concerned. I've stated it many times. D Reaper is not a control deck. It has control elements, but it's only controlling in its goal of getting to its combo turn and then executing its combo turn, winning the game. If you're at 10, 11, 12 sources of Mother, something has gone terribly wrong. And even though you have a great board state, if you have no way to close it out, you end up losing to the true control decks. Or you're just kind of wasting time if you're playing against Imperial with 12 sources under your Mother and just playing free everything every turn.
And I think this is where black kind of edges yellow out because like yellow outside of D Reaper or outside of Reaper has actual no way of winning because of how D Reapers function as a whole. At least with black, if you have a couple of sources underneath, you could still Zubagon punch like a gatekeeper. You could still even Zubagon punch like a Jerry if it's big enough. Like there's still other things that you could do with black that make it a little bit more well rounded. Yellow does have some really good stuff in stall tactics, and like I'm not saying yellow is bad, it's just I as a player want to play something that has more usage and more uses rather than something kind of one note, one dimensional and very luck based.
Yeah. Um, while this deck does have some access to recovery, um, almost exclusively via Gatekeeper, you can play yellow forms of recovery, but outside of that, it is just Gatekeeper. Um,
Well, like the
so
goal is to like gatekeeper out of security, then tactical retreat, put gatekeeper away, use the BT8 Kari to gain a memory if you need to
mhm.
hard play a gatekeeper. Like the yellow version is more gatekeeper focused, and then you just have some okay removal options
Yeah.
just to try to act as your stall.
And so this is um the discussion that Zenitsu had about like where we wanted to go with this is that a lot of times you hear people talk about deck lists and why they think something is better, but we're gonna try and do our best to really break it down and make it um, understandable as far as why and in the specific role that these cards are playing. So, taking the example of like yellow versus black and D Reaper, you have your two cards that you're running in that are essentially the mirror versions of themselves. You have Breath of the Gods and Zubagon Punch for black, and you have Tactical Retreat and Holy Flame for yellow. And they, on a surface level, are fairly similar. They are both, all of them are cheap. Um, Tactical Retreat being one cost, Breath, and everything else being two cost. But their functions are not the same, and it really matters. So Breath of the Gods is kind of your Holy Flame replacement because they're both two cost options that are significantly worse in hand, but are way better in security and are functionally for most decks the same in security. Um, Meaning Breath of the Gods security effect is that opponents cannot attack you for the remainder of the turn. They cannot declare attacks. Period. Dot. Um, Whereas Holy Flames is just a blanket board aura that states all opponents' Digimon get security attack -1, the same vein that Gatekeeper does, but Gatekeeper requires 6 sources under Mother to activate that effect. So, in function, they're the same, but as Zenitsu mentioned, Breath at least is aggressive when it needs to be, or it is capable of aggression. So you swing with a Gatekeeper and you just give it reboot so that you can't get swung over. You swing with um, any of your low of the ground um, Digimon and they can't get swung over. Or, forehead level, like next level thinking, Pilates and Jerry both have effects that suspend themselves without attacking, making it so that they don't risk dying to security, but giving them reboot is still valuable. Um, And then I guess the third level of it being is depending upon the deck you're playing into, Breath of the Gods secures you a win con with your combo turn and your Reaper because playing into um, Megadeth or Kikaitis Breath or Wyvern's Breath, Breath of the Gods stops all of those if you play it on your Reaper on your combo turn, assuming you start your turn with at least 2 memory. So this is really just like anyone could just say, hey, play the black package, it's better. But we're really trying to break down why we think it's better, and hopefully you can adapt these lines of thinking and thought processes to other decks.
And like just as like a counter argument or like just bringing up other points, like yellow can still be very successful. Izzy, like Izzy Cruz, shouts him, he's a good player. He went into the PPG like regional and got top 16 with the yellow variant. So like just because we're saying we think that black is better for X reasons, this is just our interpretation on what we understand in terms of card value. Um, but Izzy, despite all that, took the yellow side of it and still did relatively well. I'm just going to pull up his list really quick. Here
Um,
it is.
while you do that, yeah, that's a good point. So I really broke down Breath of the Gods versus Holy Flame specifically. Um, there's
Yeah, because
also
he's not even running recovery. It's just one yellow reinforced memory boost and then 4 spiral masquerade. So he is more hardcore into just using yellow to stall and try to deal with the opponent's threats
well,
more
it's
than
yeah,
actually
removal.
try
It's
to use cards. Yeah.
because Breath of the Gods and Holy Flame are exactly that. They are stall, whereas at least Spiral Masquerade is straight up removal and can solve a decent amount of complex board states that a lot of other cards will miss certain ends. So you can have, um, because if I'm correct, I haven't played with Spiral a whole lot recently. Um,
Spiral is just minus 3k per Digimon you have on the field. Mother will always just make it so it's minus 3k no matter what, which for 4 is like okay, it's a little on the
okay,
expensive
but
side,
Spiral
but
lets you
if
go.
they
Spiral's flexibility is the same way that
is
it can go big or wide or both if needed.
yes. Yes. Like that's why Spiral is such a good card for D Reapers for the yellow package. And I think the recovery side of like yellow is kind of bait because it is more luck based. Like I don't know if people realize this, but D Reaper security is going to be bad more
It's
often than
pretty
not.
boo-boo garbage. We found that like because the average DP, all of the D Reapers you want to be playing are almost exclusively lower than like so they're either 1K, that's your searchers, that's you're running 16 at the very minimum to like 20 searchers. Then you're running 4 of bubbles, Pilates, I guess not exclusively Pilates, but bubbles, uh pendulum, um Pilates, and
Pilates is like there are those three are
they're all
3Ks.
3Ks, and then
Jerry
Jerry's a
is a
5K.
5K.
So Jerry's your high end as far as so if they're swinging with 6K, like unless they hit Reaper or Gatekeeper, they're fine. Basically, those are the
Seven,
only
yeah,
cards.
7k are almost guaranteed to be fine. Depending like if somebody's running creepy hands for whatever reason, like having the blocker is not terrible. It's just not amazing. It just
So
doesn't feel super great.
in I get the argument for direct comparison again is Zubagon Punch is just better than Creepy Hand. Obviously, Creep is consistent blocker, but the the likelihood of that being relevant for multiple turns and not being able to be played around is fairly minimal because um, rookie rush isn't really a thing so much anymore. People aren't swinging with rookies expecting them to live or swinging with rookies and allowing them to die into blockers. So, um,
Well, that and there's just a lot of like low level removal.
yeah.
And I'm using the word level loosely because D Reapers don't have level, so they dodge level based removal. But there's still just a lot of like removal for like things that are like 6 play cost or 6,000 DP and below. There's just a very easy ways to remove them, so it functionally makes the blockers useless. At least the in quotation marks traditional 6k level 4 blockers.
Yeah. Um, and so it really does go back to what do you value in your deck, and since it's a combo deck, you only care about your combo, and as a result of that, so Creep Hands doesn't add sources to Mother. It doesn't accelerate your game state. Horn Striker does not add sources to Mother. Does not accelerate your game state. Well, the Horn Striker and Creep Hands are at least slightly more playable in theory than Optimizer, only because Optimizer also has a Mother trigger condition of 5 sources, and maybe it helps if you're, but then if you have 5 sources under Mother, so at a minimum this is costing you 5. I don't know if it's good enough because it's just too slow tempo wise to, regardless of what you play, because the best case scenario is you just play another optimizer, whereas more than likely you're gonna play like it was more like a math thing, like because I really liked optimizer when the errata put the cards on top of your deck instead of on the bottom of your deck. But I really went through what cards do I actually care about because again, most often you're gonna see searchers. You might see 3 searchers, and then cool, I paid 5 memory to drop another searcher for free. Or, but that honestly may screw me more than anything because if I have too many searchers down, I can't reduce their cost to cycle them. Pendulum Feet only cost 3 anyway, so he might add 2 cards to your hand, but who cares? Bubbles at least accelerates your game state, but is it worth playing Optimizer to potentially hit a Bubbles to play another Searcher? I don't think so. And then Jerry And Pilates, you run into the problem of, okay, you played a good card that would cost you a decent amount otherwise, but they don't do anything the turn they come down, and you usually don't want to risk them being removed before they can do what they want to do. Playing a optimizer which then plays you a free Jerry just allows them to have the opportunity to kill said Jerry.
Yeah, and like that goes into like why those cards usually aren't seen in a whole lot of lists is because of literally what Neko was just saying. They're like good in theory, but in practice, they're just not efficient enough at doing what D Reapers wants to do, and that's just accelerate its game plan, count to seven, so that way it could have Reaper online. Usually, from my own personal experience, I like going eight, especially if I could afford to go eight, just for that extra little bit of safety. But you don't have to. Like getting to seven, going Reaper and doing Reaper things is just good enough most of the time.
Um, that is a good point about the sources for Reaper. The only thing that I guess like I've done kind of passively while playing is that I usually have 8 anyway because um my opponent is going to be able to hit my security at least a little bit, and there's a very good chance they hit a searcher. So as long as they hit at least a searcher in security, um, that gives me my eighth source. Um,
Well, I'm just saying, like
yeah, I know.
the A
I'm just
source
pointing it
under
out.
Mother to make it Reaper 16, so that way you're guaranteed, especially
Well,
in the mirror, to be able to clear almost anything you want.
well, Reaper's 17 because it's a when attacking trigger.
Oh, yeah, you're
Yeah,
right.
so
I'm
yeah.
silly.
Nope, you're fine. Yeah, so he comes into play. Your opponent can't respond to it until Reaper attacks. When attacking, tuck two searchers. So the first check is Reaper at 17, and then it only gets bigger from there. The only downside would be you first check Wyvern's Breath. Now it's 2k, and then you're swinging for 4k on the following swing, um, potentially dying to security at that point. But so you're never dying on your first swing, regardless. Um, unless you hit hard removal, Gaia Force, stuff like that. Um, so that is something to note. The the extra source in my point was just that because you add two sources per Reaper per restand, um, the eighth source gives you an extra swing because if you do toss 7, you only get 3 restands, and then you have an extra searcher in the trash.
And the crazy thing is, like, Mother just helping reduce the play cost of a lot of your cards just make like your mid stages a lot better to sit on. And you could just accidentally have a decent sized board, which is why Spyro Masquerade is so favored and highly sought after in like the yellow side, is because you could just accidentally have four Digimon sitting on the field. Like it is a thing, especially since the opponent knows that there, if you're going up against Reaper, you're on a clock. Like
Mm-hmm.
once Reaper gets its sources, once Reaper can play Reaper, the game should basically be over because you could chip with Pilates, you could chip with Bubble. If you really wanted to, you could even chip with Jerry. Um, so like you just do a little bit of passive chip while setting up your engine, and then you just go. And if the opponent doesn't beat you out before then they literally just almost lose unless their security is that good.
Yeah, and against most aggro decks, most notably Imperial Dramon, 7 isn't necessarily the goal, it's 6 with a Gatekeeper. Because Gatekeeper does do a good enough job most of the time, at least wasting their turn, getting rid of it. Um, and then you can then just get your 7th source on the following turn, winning the game. Um,
I mean, that's why Gatekeeper is so good, and that's why like a lot of yellow variants want to run Recover and stuff just to be able to spam out Gatekeepers
mhm.
or like be able to use it a little bit more efficiently, have a higher chance of being able to use it out of security. Like it's not a bad gameplay, it's just
It feels a little more
it
Win Mori though,
it
and
does.
because
That's
in the matchups where you're playing Gatekeeper for an exorbitant amount of memory because you're not at your 5, 6, 7, you're not at your combo range. I'm playing Gatekeeper at 4 because if I don't, I lose. I need to recover, and then so the opportunity to gatekeeper and tactical retreat in the same turn is so outside the reach of most decks that that's a very edge case situation. I guess way more likely is luck sacking in the form of they flip a gatekeeper and I happen to have tactical retreat in my hand, but you didn't know it was there because you can't check your security. You're not playing yellow TK, and you also only have 5 security to begin with. You're not yellow hybrid where you're really dealing with, you know, 8, 9, 10 security over the course of a game. So you only run 4 copies of Gatekeeper. What are your odds you actually get one in security and they flip it and you can then throw it back? So it feels a little Winmori. I am not as opposed to Spiral. I think there's a much better argument made for Spiral because a lot of your low to the ground, your searchers, your pendulums, your bubbles, your jerrys, don't need to swing if you are like on board with the Spiral Masquerade game plan because you don't need the chip because you can just kind of like erase pressure with Spiral and then you can get a little bit to a safer range with your Reaper. Maybe you have, 10 sources or something like that and or you have 8 sources, one or two are from security, your 7 sources underneath your mother, and then you can then use your um other Digimon that were just sitting there as spiral fodder to now swing following the Reaper combo.
And like D Reapers just as a deck is like relatively flexible just because like you run the classic D Reaper package and then you could just splash in whatever color you want. So like we're talking a lot about red or not red. We're talking a lot about yellow and black, but like there's some other like very cute and cheeky things that you could do with D Reapers depending on the type of direction you want to take it. I know one of the other sub packages that's kind of popular is red, just because red has Rowdy Rocker. So, like, Rowdy Rocker is a card that not only draws you 2 cards, but accelerates your game plan because you could put a red level 4 Digimon underneath one of your Digimon, AE your mother. So, the best card to put under your mother is Guilmon. Or not Guilmon, Growlmon from the Gallantmon starter deck, because if you're already going to be running red removal cards, then you're just going to gain a memory for literally just having a mother sit on the field and you're just using removal cards. And red has some really good removal cards, but again, that's also going into the stall tactic that like is kind of pseudo trappy. But you also get cards like a delicate plan to make sure that when you Reaper, your Reaper is going to be as safe as it possibly can to try to win that turn on top of all of the other boost options that red has if it wants to play more aggressively. Even though its tamer quality sucks for the deck, you still have like you still have cards and opportunities to figure out something to play.
Yeah, that's a good point as far as I guess just looking at cards and using them in different applications. Um, uh, at the end of our playtesting yesterday, Zenitsu and I had like a long conversation about um, applications of cards and designer intent and how uh, card game players are very good at breaking interactions in cards. Um, more specific, like I guess the example specifically was um, the line of play in Imperial Dramon where you can use hidden potential on a Paildramon to just digivolve itself, splitting the sources and then creating a new Paildramon to then swing further. It's essentially just extending your line of play and how there's no way in hell when they designed Jogress as a even if they're both played for like they can DNA for free and then it can keep swinging and Paildramon can swing twice because of it just says it can. Nowhere in that design boardroom was that line of play addressed, and now Imperial sitting here abusing it as a result of it. So looking
Well, I
for.
mean,
Well,
that's part of the reason why hidden potential was limited to one, because
yes.
it's like, because green has the ability to do some like incredibly stupid things with its high level Digimon. And I think more so the unhealthy interaction with hidden potential in Imperial is more because of Ken and Davis. Because
Mm,
Ken and Davis, you get to
allows you to
unsuspend
unsuspend
the
it. Yeah.
Digimon for Digivolving,
Yep.
which you suspended
Yeah.
to
It gets rid
Digivolve
of
for
the
free.
entire cost associated at all. Um,
Right.
but yeah, the idea of tucking sources under Mother, red sources specifically, is nowhere in the design decision of D-Reaper. So the idea that a package could adopt that and utilize that for its own benefit. I mean, even if we dial all the way back to the black package, Zubagon Punch was it's meant to be an aggression card. It's meant to be, hey, if you have a big boy, you can make him bigger and punch harder and then also protect you on the following turn. It was not meant to, hey, take this card that's just sitting there passively absorbing resources and make it a blocker for a turn.
And that's kind of like the magic of like figuring out new and interesting ways to apply some of these cards. And I was even going as far as thinking like, oh, what are some good purple synergy cards or good green and blue synergy cards? Like, I think red, black, and yellow are a little bit more obvious because of just how D Reapers wants to work in general. Um, but that's just one case example, and there's multiple different decks where it's just like we could apply cards in different ways that they might not have expected that end up being really spicy tech cards. We saw this with Dan Vang when he was working with DNA Imperial. He added in Nidhoggmon just because, like, Nidhoggmon is not a searchable card outside of Davis. None of, like, literally nothing outside of Davis searches it. It's just a tech one of that you could use because DNA can add sources underneath, so that way you could actually have a uh, an easier or other alternative way to digivolve into Nidhogg. We see this with just a whole bunch of other different decks, and that's kind of what makes and defines spicy tech. And sometimes those tech options could help you win games more often than lose games.
So it really just comes down to understanding why certain cards are played in certain decks, and then really asking yourself the question and really evaluating for yourself whether or not am I playing to this deck's strengths? Am I adding these cards for the right reasons? Am I trying to do what this deck wants to do? And assessing because um, Digimon isn't a game with too many exceptionally difficult decisions to be made. Really, your hardest decision and your easiest decision aren't too far apart by most card game standards, but as a result of that, the decision made is slightly more impactful because you're not going to either completely blow your opponent out or completely throw the game away in the span of a micro decision. You're instead going to accrue, you know, if you played out that match 100 times and your hands and deck remain the same, if you make a slightly different decision, are you improving the likelihood of success versus are you potentially going down a path where you are more likely to lose?
And I think that's like going into what defines a good player is they just have a better understanding of not only just what their deck is doing at any given time, because like I've when I'm playing in events, I know, like as an example, Imperial, I'm only running X amount of Hammer Sparks, I'm only running X amount of Mega Deaths. So like when I see one in my hand, one in my security, I could evaluate how valuable the rest of those cards are in my deck and the likelihood of me seeing them to get out of or get into situations that would be advantageous for me. And those types of micro managing decisions in terms of being able to progress the game state to make those opportunities more prevalent is something that a lot of good players tend to do. and why a lot of the top players are top players and why they can consistently do what they do and get results is because they have that understanding.
Yeah. Um, One thing I hear a decent amount of is that because Digimon doesn't have those super game altering decisions, or at least outside of the norm, um, by most players' evaluation of plays, they're not going to tell the difference between do I do X or do Y. Obviously there are very wrong ways to play the game, and but we're talking more along the lines of do I do I play my tamer? Do I go to my level 4 first? Depends on, what is my opponent seeing? What deck am I playing? You know, should I look through my security first, or should I look through the top of my deck first? Which is more valuable? Do I remember what's in my security? Stuff like that as far as like yellow hybrid's concerned. But um even with
Even like, oh, go ahead.
even with those decisions and that level of information, the better player still wins more often, and we've seen that because there are names. We mentioned names like Dan Vang because they consistently are at top tables. And if the game truly was the coin flip that some people believe it to be, that I'm playing Imperial, so I'm gonna make a top table. That's just not true. The deck isn't that easy to pilot itself. That just because it isn't that hard to pilot at the at most extreme end doesn't mean that it's brain dead.
And this could even go into something like not even deck related in terms of like matchup related, where it's like you also have to understand what the opponent's deck is doing, what they're trying to do. So, like, just as a base example, going against a hybrid deck, you always want them to go first because they're going to give you more memory than you're going to give them.
Mm,
And that just allows them to make a more efficient first play for them than for you. So that's also like just the level of thought that goes into like helping your overall win rate is just certain understandings between your deck and the opponent and the possible game plans and play lines that you have. Like D Reaper loves going first. They love going first, but
they're
they also
actually
don't mind going second.
I would honestly, having played what we played last night, I disagree. D Reaper is probably worse than a hybrid deck at going. It's worse going second than a hybrid deck going first, because going second, you offer up potentially the worst thing you ever could to your opponent, which is um if you don't have a bubbles, or even if you have a bubbles, honestly, if you don't have exactly pendulum feet, you potentially put yourself -1 searcher or +1 searcher on board because okay, so your opponent gives you an amount of memory, let's say three, two or three, or let's even one, like anything less than like 4 or 5. You hatch your mother. You cannot tuck into your mother. It's still in raising. You play your searcher. You draw your card. That second card, there are so few good things that you can do right there. You don't want to play a second searcher necessarily because now it'll cost you 3, and now you're risking, if you don't have a bubbles already, the ability to where that searcher's just going to stay on the board indefinitely, and you're always going to have to pay full cost for searchers moving forward because you can only add one to the source every turn. And or so it's basically just pendulum feet. Pendulum feet's the best case scenario, and outside of pendulum feet, you have an awful, awful, awful turn two, or a tamer, I guess. Tamers are fine, but you run fewer tamers too.
Well, I thought like you would want to go first as D Reapers just
Yeah.
because Searcher for one and then Raise Mother out. Um, like that's the ideal turn one and why I think like
So
they
searcher
always want to go
pass.
first.
Well, yeah. You
Yeah.
definitely want to go first. I'm saying, D Reaper going second is potentially a worse position for the deck than a hybrid going first, is what I'm saying. Because hybrids going first
Oh, okay.
is the reverse end.
I
Yeah,
misunderstood that.
because the hybrids have the reverse problem where they hatch an egg and they just give you 4 memory or 3 memory in the best case scenario, and that allows their opponent on their first turn to do quite a bit. Whereas, like, yeah, as I explained with the D Reapers, Your opponent gives you 2 memory. You hatch, you play a searcher for 1, and what you pass, because now you're just going to give them 3 for nothing. You either play a pendulum, you can't play a bubbles because you can't tuck into the mother yet. You can't play a Jerry, it's too expensive. You can't Pilates is even more expensive. Like what are you going to play besides another searcher which you don't necessarily want to do or a pendulum or a tamer. Tamer and pendulum are the only cards you have in your deck to where I would feel like that I'm not at a tempo disadvantage already because unless I would play second searcher if I had a bubbles in hand, but you are still passing turn with 2 exposed searchers, risking a very devastating board wipe early on,
Because you don't want to add searchers from your hand if you could avoid it. You always just want to hard play, get that draw,
and
and
then
then
cycle
shove
it.
it
Yeah.
under.
So that's really what I was talking is that because even if you have a bubbles in hand for the following turn to add the second searcher, you risk your opponent for, you know, they could just spiral, or anything cheap. Just them getting rid of those searchers before you can tuck them in because the mother's still in raising on your first turn is very dangerous. If they have a removal source, if they have a removal card on their second turn or a method of removal. I mean, honestly, that would be like best case scenario for like the Gallantmon deck if you happen to be playing against one.
I think Galamon's good. He definitely has some issues that I know are going to be worked out in the next set, BT9, because like you get a whole nother Guilmon line, so that gives you 4 full Guilmon lines to flesh out the deck on top of any generic red tools that you feel
Mm.
like you could use.
I like
But that's
Gallant
getting
X
ahead of
Antibody.
ourselves.
I like Gallant X Antibody from the movie. I don't like it as a card. um, but yeah, so you don't want to go second as D Reaper if you can avoid it. Um, you do want to go first because you will like unless you have a absolutely booty hand, you can searcher, give them 1 and pass, and it's great, and you love life. Um, um, I mean, we could do more. I could do more yellow hybridy stuff, but I feel like I don't want to get too in the weeds and above people's heads. I'm trying to keep stuff more because at least when we talk about D Reaper, it we are mentioning D Reaper specifically, but we're applying the situations to other decks, whereas yellow hybrid has a lot of yellow hybrid only problems. I guess D
I
Reaper
mean,
does a little bit too, but
yeah. Well, yellow hybrids kind of is like Z Reapers, where it's like you do have a lot of various sub packages that you could run and include in the deck to really spice it up and customize it. Like with EX2, um, we could start thinking about utilizing red a little bit more, and we know that the red side is going to be a little bit more dominant just because we're getting good red yellow support. So, but that doesn't necessarily shun out the purple support because we still have purple yellow support that's really good. So like all of the stuff that we were talking about with D Reapers in terms of like tech packages and various other tech and tools applies to a multitude of other decks as well.
yeah, it really just comes down to, um, I guess something else that because we mentioned it at least, but like truly knowing your opponent's deck and not necessarily every card in it, but like on average what you expect to see, how many removal sources do they usually run? How many tamers do they usually run? How many just like options that are gonna trip you up in security do they run? Like being able to like math that shit out in your head real quick, like just running just like very like rudimentary odds, because like it's a card game. You do have to count cards a little bit when you're playing, as Zenitsu had kind of mentioned, yourself and your opponent. Okay, I have seen one Eden's Javelin. I run 4. I haven't bot decked any yet. Um, there aren't any in security, or there may be one in security, or if I play my TK and I look at my security and I see Kazemon, a Jet Sylphimon, an Ophanimon, another Tamer, and then an option card, it's like, okay, well, what am I gonna grab here? Because if that Tamer's Zoe, I could grab Zephyr or Jet Sylphie, and then they flip Zoe, giving me the other one. But if they just hit the Digimon, it's just gone forever. And these are like the micro decisions that can not necessarily decide games. They're not like, is it the end of the world if I don't have access to one more level 4 that I could have potentially? No, but um, just knowing when I play a Zoe, is she gonna replace herself? Are there hybrids in security? How many? And just really like that's why I like yellow personally, because it you do have that control element that I really enjoyed from Magic, which is just winning the war of information. I know what's in my security, I know what's in my hand, and I know what's in my deck. So I have three methods of just triangulating. Um, okay, I just bought decked a Wyvern's Breath. There isn't one in security. There isn't one in my hand. So the however many draws I have left or recoveries, there's only one more Wyvern's Breath. I only run two. Or like sometimes faking your opponent out or your opponent losing to themselves in ways because there have been times where I've been sitting there, I know I'm dead on board, and my opponent doesn't know it because I know that there's only tamers in security, and my opponent's afraid to swing with his level 4 because he needs it for a Jogress or something, and he's not going to hit a Edens, he's not going to hit a Wyverns, and I know that, and they don't, and but you also just can't play around information you don't have.
Yep. I mean, I can't you summed it up pretty nicely. Sometimes you just can't do anything about it, but you don't know unless you try, and like you still always have to try. And I feel like some people just give up midway where it's
Mm.
just like, oh, um it's just yellow hybrids. It's just a bad matchup. Boo hoo. Like you could still attempt to do things. Like that's the magic of Digimon for me. Is like in other card games, there's tons of like cards that just say no, you can't play the game. In Digimon, you could always attempt to play the game, and that's what I enjoy out of it. Is I'm never out of the game. I don't know what that last security is. I don't know certain things, so I still have to see where things go, and I still have to try my best to do what I can with what I have.
Um.
And even though sometimes it feels really bad, sometimes those bad plays are actually good plays. Like
Mm.
during our playtesting, I didn't realize that hard playing a Pyldramon, or not Pyldramon, a Dino Bee for 8 was the correct play because you didn't have any memory to respond with. And that's what made Megazoo so good way back when, was because it just relied on the opponent not having a response.
Right, an efficient response. Yeah. D Reapers. Um. Because especially early in the game, can't really utilize the memory a whole lot. Like my best case scenario is if I had a Jerry, I can slam a Jerry in response and tuck a source, but that's not going to match the tempo of a level 5 on board. Even if it's just a level 5 with no sources, but the even like the potential better play in the mind of the opponent at least is, oh, well, what if he has Pilates? But Pilates, his removal is DP based, so if it's turn 2, I have 2 or 3 sources underneath my mother, I can't kill Dino Bee yet. I physically can't. It's too big. So um, at that point, it doesn't matter if I can hard play a Pilates for free because it doesn't do anything yet. It needs sources.
And it's just those types of small decisions where it's just like knowing the matchup, knowing your plays, and working with what you have. Sometimes could make the unexpected happen, and that could be very fun and very exciting, and definitely swing games in one side's favor versus the other. But that does require a specific level of understanding to be able to reach those types of decisions.
The I I laugh a little bit because um, it's almost always never mattered because again, coming from Magic where um, there is inter-turn interaction between players in the form of instant spells and such. Having been in tournaments where the opponent will ask me how many cards in hand. I'm not playing yellow hybrid. Who cares? I mean, obviously there's a reason for the question. It is technically free information, but like, okay, I have 8 cards in hand, but as long as you're playing a traditional deck, traditional meaning you're just kind of digivolving and playing tamers every once in a while and options every once in a while, most cards replace themselves. So I start with 5. I digivolve a couple times. I still have 5. Unless now it's I have one. The only actual cards that add to hand are some edge case searchers or um stuff like that, or just every turn I gain +1. So if you're asking, you're so almost sometimes asking me what turn is it, because I have 8 cards in hand. I started with 5. I now have 8.
Well,
Um.
I asked the question for like an anti-cheat thing on top of just I sometimes do need that information to evaluate what you possibly could have in your hand. It's just like, okay, you have 8 cards as Imperial.
Mhm.
What does that mean? Well, there's a very high likelihood they're probably going to have an option. They're at least going to have a level 3, maybe a level 4. They could even have their full combo set up.
Mm.
Um, so like it's still not bad information to have to infer based on what you've seen and you could guess what's in their deck because like for the most part Digimon a lot of people go with a core or base shell and then they'll just iterate upon that, which that's not wrong. It's just it makes things very predictable and easy to read up to a certain extent.
Where I was going with it was not necessarily that it's a bad question to ask, because you're right, there are technically reasons for it, but um, more so along the lines of it feels kind of like an automatic or nervous response, like people flipping through cards in their hand, um, and usually they're not making these forehead gigabrain calculations in their head, because ultimately they can only be guesses. I could have only level 6s with the 6 cards in my hand, or I could have no level 6s in the 10 cards in my hand, and you have no idea, and the number is irrelevant. But more so, I bring it up as a means of referencing how people can ask for information or take in information and immediately discard it. Like as a thought piece, playing yellow hybrid requires you remember a little bit more sometimes, because you are dealing with trying to remember what's in your security, what what's been flipped out of your security, and stuff like that. But just from a base level, um, try and remember things throughout the game. Just while playtesting, right? Like if you're playing against an opponent and they play a Davis or they play a now, I've never hit this point in Digimon, and I don't ever think I necessarily would, because it's more so just tedious. But I remember playing in some control versus control matchups in Magic where the real legit hardcore people, not necessarily like people that like tried way harder, but people that like cared enough at least, they'd bring like a whole ass fucking notepad and they would just write everything down. Like I look at your opponent's hand. I'm going to write down every card, and now I can visually track what has he played, what has he not played, what is still there for in his hand, and you can do that technically kind of with Digimon a little bit. Keep like I'm not saying you should keep a notebook, but like just you should kind of get to the point where you can track it enough without having to write it down, I guess. But I guess if you're at like some super like if I was at Nats, I'd probably start writing shit down. Hopefully it's not online again. But um the idea being that they don't think you're cheating, because it is free information. If my opponent Davises and flips, you know, jamming Vmon, Pyildramon, Davis and Ken, and then takes the Vmon and the Pyildramon, he just tucked a Tamer. I'm writing that shit down. Like that's relevant, and it may come up. So, or at least being able to, and I guess the thought experiment slash like way to challenge yourself is to do something like that. Like if you're playing with a friend or if you're playing a friendly match, just take a very early instance of momentary information and have like the opponent like your opponent plays the Davis, have them write it down, and then have them ask you 3, 4 turns later, what were the 3 cards that I flipped with that Davis on turn 2? And if you can't remember, it shows you what information you're truly holding on to and processing. And there's a lot of stuff going on, and I can't tell you that I maintain that to that level at all, but I'm at least aware that I don't maintain it.
I mean, I'm not. I kind of do the same thing. I obviously build lots of decks on YouTube, and I kind of just do a lot of research. So I just didn't naturally have an intuition on what somebody's going to be running the second they flip over that egg and start playing their cards. Sometimes my expectations are subverted, but most of the time they're not. So, like, in one of my regionals, as an example, I faced KVN, very good security control player. I know he only plays security control because that's what he's comfortable and familiar with, and who knows, he might like luck sacking and not really actually playing the game. But I digress. I knew what his deck was trying to do, and I was the only player in that entire event that played around what he was trying to do. And that's the difference between, like, I'm not saying I'm better than everyone he faced, cuz I ended up tying that game because, I almost won because, his deck just recovers and stalls, and that's what it's designed to do. But like, just knowing what the opponent can do and is doing is huge, especially knowing the pool of cards that they're going to be playing. I didn't know his exact deck that he was playing, but I knew the style of deck and how to beat or at least play against that style of deck is definitely very, very good information.
That's something to be said too. Just um, there is a lot of skill in playing to the middle tiers in card games. Um, Basically, the idea or concept that you, if you're not playing one of your well practiced, well rehearsed tier 1 versus tier 1 matchups, I am Imperial versus Yellow Hybrid. I am a Imperial versus Mastamon. I am Mastamon versus X Antibody. You're not playing one of those matchups you've played dozens, I guess hopefully, really preferably, that you've practiced these matchups, you understand your wins, you understand your opponent's wins. It's when you start to go a little bit beyond that, and now you don't know exactly what your opponent's playing. Um, my first, my most recent, I guess, experience with it was um, in the last event I played in. I was playing a yellow hybrid mirror match, but my opponent was playing yellow hybrid purple eggs with a purple package, and I had no clue what he was trying to do with it, and it really put me off my game. Do I play around Lucimon Chaos Mode? I don't know if he's playing it. He might. Am I playing around actual Mastamon in Yellow Hybrid? Is like he's playing Tamers, he's playing hybrids. He has purple eggs and the yellow Digimon that digivolve from purple eggs. So he's probably going to try and work in Rapidmon there. I and you something I got caught up in the what the hell is he trying to do, and I diverged from my standard practices in the yellow hybrid mirror, and I lost as a result of it. And really looking back on it, I remember thinking like, had I just pretended that his eggs were yellow, I would have been fine. But the purple eggs threw me off, and then just a couple other cards in the deck, because in the yellow hybrid mirror, Chaos Degradation and Wyvern's Breath are functionally the same, outside of getting the recovery or outside of getting the level 4 from Ophanimon if you kill it. But so I was just really struggling to figure out what the hell I was playing against, and the ability for you to just level with yourself and play your game and worry less about what your opponent is doing.
And I think that leans into something like D Reaper's strengths. is because it is a deck that is very true to its own game plan. We saw in the recent PPG regional in person at Too Many Games gaming convention. In the top four, there were two red OTK decks. Those are
Mm,
very one note, one dimensional decks that are literally trying to do one thing, and that's build a ginormous stack with Ancient Greymon, move it out, and then punch the opponent's security away, and then Omni for game. Like, that is literally what the deck is trying to do. It doesn't care about anything the opponent has, it doesn't care about any of the opponent's setup or anything. It's just doing its own thing, marching to the beat of its own drum, and it found some really good success. I also think it caught a lot of people off guard because it was another unconventional deck where it's just like, who's playing a red OTK deck now? Like, I thought if they were playing red, it's going to be red hybrids or Jessmon or something, or even Gallantmon. It's just like it might have just caught people off guard. They didn't know what to do against it, and they lost because of it.
yeah. Um, and not to give, not to like say that that deck doesn't have skill behind it just because it wants to OTK, because a lot of what Red Hybrid does is it allows you not to have to worry about certain things like, oh, I'm tall enough to where I don't care if I hit a big Digimon security. I have the Altamon inheritable. I don't care if I hit an option. So it allows you to tunnel and narrow in and not have to worry about those edge case scenarios because you're not going to lose to a Hammer Spark. You're not going to lose to a Wyvern's Breath. You're not going to lose to hitting a Susano in security.
And that's the strength of the deck. And I think like certain decks like that could perform better depending on the overall meta. So like the fastest deck right now meta wise is I would probably say
Still probably
Armor
Imperial.
Rush. Yeah,
Probably
it's like
Imperial.
Armor Rush, then Imperial. I think Armor Rush is just a little bit faster than Imperial, but it dies harder to control. Um,
Yeah.
but like if your average fastest deck is going to be Imperial and you already know how to navigate around Imperial, or like if Imperial is just ever so slightly off their game plan, you just literally raise something in your raising area and then just move it out and auto win. Like it plays a lot of consistency tools like memory boosts. It doesn't run a whole lot of tamers, at least in terms of like that deck, but it is just a very one-dimensional deck that does what it does very well. And if the other person doesn't know how to play against it, then oops.
Yeah. I mean, usually a fairly uh true statement in regards to card games is that as the meta is indeterminate and people are wondering what to play and how many cards to play of it and is this card good, is that card good, aggro decks are a little bit more favored in those early uncertainties, especially older, more decided, like last format's best aggro deck. And um, so the red popping up doesn't really surprise me that much, because it is a very quick check to, can you either stop me from doing what I want to do, but you're mostly doing it in raising, or can you out tempo me? And it really puts a very tight clock on the opponent to try and deal with a red aggro deck.
And I think like that goes to the strengths of like being able to be a good player and read the meta to know, hey, I know the meta's changed. I know this is a very unconventional deck. It's like D Reapers. It's very one note, dimensional. If I just do my thing, build my stack, swing out, and I win, that's all I need. And if I could do that repeatedly, again, that's all I need, especially if they're still trying to figure out what my deck actually is doing. It's like, oh, in terms of like what this deck was doing, it was utilizing Metal Greymon, Alteris mode to Digivolve in raising on top of your Aldemon. You don't care about the Aldemon's abilities at all. You're just using it just to have the ability to not check options or like make the options not matter. So it's like it's a very interesting deck, and it relates a lot to like D Reapers and just how reading the meta and understanding what people are going to want to play and what people are playing could actually lead to your benefit.
Um, I guess the last thing that I want to touch upon before um, we start to close it out is just the idea that um, even you if you've played a matchup more than a handful of times, your opponent will know what you're trying to do. And as we've said before, D Reaper has a very finite line of play to where it wants to play cheap things, it wants to cycle cards, it wants to tuck sources that allow it to cycle more cards and tuck more sources, and then eventually kill you. And then hopefully along the way, stalling you, uh, holding out just long enough, potentially chipping away, potentially just preventing the opponent from attacking or removing source or removing things that could attack by like killing them. And but that doesn't mean that that pilot and that player can't outskill your opponent. Just because you know what I'm trying to do doesn't mean you can stop me from doing it. And especially if I do it better, then you can stop me from doing it.
Yeah, I think
Because
that's a good
there's
sentiment.
still a difference between a good D Reaper player and a bad D Reaper player, and even a difference between a great D Reaper player and an okay or good D Reaper player, because the metric that I had tossed out to Zenitsu, I think, as far as Digimon is concerned, is that most decks, as far as their difficulties, they're not super complicated to play. Most people who have a thorough understanding of what the cards do and maybe just a little cheat sheet of like some of the more obscure interactions um, or lines of play that the deck can use to gain advantages, then most players can play the deck and pilot it fairly successfully against a player of equal skill with a deck of equal skill. And I'd say like as far as if one's your like you could hand it to an actual child that just understands the rules of the game and they can play it to its optimal level, and a 10 being you need a PhD in Digimon to pilot the deck successfully. Most decks fall in like a 3 to 5 range, easy to medium difficulty, with very few decks, most notably uh, iterations of Lilith Loop, maybe current Mastamon and some of the intricacies. Just a lot of purple, mostly because you have to worry about your trash and what's in your trash and what's not in your trash. And every time you put something in your trash, you're completely changing a potential future game state because you either needed that in trash or you needed it in hand. So outside of those, which I would say are more along the lines of like sevens, but really there aren't any Gigabrain four-head decks in Digimon, and therefore just being on average more knowledgeable, making those slight gains will allow you to beat someone who's playing to a lower level than you are.
Because like I've just as another example, I've beaten a multitude of players at local levels with basically starter decks, and I just have a better understanding of the game than they do. So my skill expression just shows that even though my deck is functionally worse than what they could be playing. Like I've built and I literally give cards to people at my locals to make sure that they could play the game to at least the capacity that they're comfortable with. I might not give them everything, but I do give them quite a lot. Um, and I still end up winning even though their deck is better. And I play lots of jank at locals to do some like fun testing, but I always win. And it kind of at the start of the game's life hurt my locals because I would always win because my skill expression was higher because I pay attention to things a little bit better. But I think right now my current play pool is like okay. Um, they're not amazing players by any stretch of the mean, but they're not like awful players. They're slowly getting better, and I'm helping them definitely make better decks to at least help them be better.
Hmm. I don't have that problem. Everyone at my locals is cracked and they're all fantastic, so I more often show up to locos and get like it's basically like I'm showing up to an ultimate cup or a regional every time I show up to locals based on outside of like maybe the first or second round. If I win my first round, I'm playing someone who attended nationals in round two. Just because we have a small enough, dedicated enough player base. Um, and but it allows me to practice to that upper level more frequently. Um, and not I kind of don't necessarily wish my locals was that competitive all the time. Um, but people still do play fun decks. I have learned uh, a few interesting combinations of uh, cards through playing people at locals that I wouldn't have ever seen or cared to see because I just don't build these decks and I don't play against people who build these decks frequently enough, especially in like major tournaments. You're not going to see um like the Malamyotis deck. I know you mentioned someone at your locals play. Like someone at my locals like is a huge Malamyotis fan and has played every iteration of Purple, Retaliation, etc. since the game's inception.
Yeah, I mean, I have a Milo player at my locals too. He kind of is still figuring out what he wants to play. So I just helped him build red hybrids. I gave him literally all of the cards to build the newest Mallow deck. Um, so like he's still learning. But yeah, like just skill expression, lots of practice, and deck choices and deck teching do go a long way in terms of your overall success. Um, it might seem super easy and simple to say, but it's a lot harder to grasp for a lot of players because they might not have the time or effort to be able to get to that point, and sometimes that's okay. Not everyone needs to be tier one hyper meta competitive, and as long as you're having fun, at the end of the day, that's what matters. But like at the same time, I as a person like seeking improvement, and I kind of want to help others seek that improvement as well.
Um, I know I said that was like my last piece, but I thought about it because I was just going over some show notes I had, and I've seen a little bit of people mention on social media now the fatigue setting in a little bit of like we've almost kind of gone in the other direction, assuming no delays for BT9. We're only gonna have 3 or 4 weeks of BT of EX2, I guess, as the most recent set. So we will have potentially 3 months of 3 sets. Um, and while that's a
Well, I
lot,
mean, it wasn't supposed to be that way because BT8 was
BT8 got
it did
delayed.
get
Yeah.
delayed. That's what screwed it up.
So assuming BT9's not delayed, which we still don't know, um, then we potentially could have 3 sets in 3 months. And I've seen some people like register some levels of fatigue to that. Like, man, that's it's a lot like for people to keep up with, and BT9 does add quite a bit. Um, I think,
BT9 is definitely the bigger game changer compared to EX2. And
yeah.
like I think this goes to the problem of the pricing, not necessarily the fatigue. I think EX sets being priced at full base sets is a mistake. I think that is the problem.
Mm,
Because they're smaller sets, they're supposed to be a supplementary set, not like equal or on par with a main set, and their pull rates are slightly different. Like it's just a completely different beast and it needs to be priced accordingly, and it's not. And I think that's part of the fatigue where it's like, okay, if EX sets were priced at $40 a booster instead of like 80, just throwing out a number,
mhm.
um, I think the fatigue would be a lot less.
Um,
Especially since they only come every half year. Once
uh,
in the summer, once in the winter seems to be their trend.
I guess what I was just gonna like, I think it's a good thing that we move forward, kind of quicker. I would like to be closer to Japan in set release than we currently are, only because I would like to be more so a part of that initialization of a meta, and less so we're 3, 4 sets behind, and we basically get whatever trash they leave behind as they go to the next coolest thing, or seeing a card announced and spoiled as it is in Japan, and then being, man, I can't wait to play that 6 months from now. Um, but uh, I think what I wanted to say, whoever hangs out to the end of these for our little pep talks, is that uh, the norm moving forward is outside of people playing whatever new. There's still always like a new archetype introduced within each set, but especially 9, um, at least, really just builds off of 8, and there aren't too many completely new archetypes being developed, and it is a lot of just decks being upgraded and taking on new names.
And that's kind of the part I'm actually looking forward to, is not always replacing our decks, and like we actually get to start adding stuff and changing things around, because even in BT10, looking at that, because we do actually have that information, um there's still a lot of upgrades and iterations to existing decks, to existing archetypes, and even just generic tools to add into like really random stuff. Like that's what I'm excited for, and I am gonna be very, very optimistic, or cautiously optimistic on their approach going forward to set design. I think it's getting better, even though like it is not built for constructed, or not constructed, sealed. But that's a completely separate issue.
So yeah, just if anyone um, is concerned with trying to keep up with making their deck competitive, or what cards am I going to have to buy and how many boxes, and um, definitely we're entering potentially singles territory as far as it may be better off just buying singles, because I have since the beginning, whenever possible at least, bought boxes, mostly because I didn't want to have to like buy playsets of at, whatever common or uncommon rate that they were, and then have to wait for them like the week and a half for them to be mailed to me. I wanted to be able to, on release day, at my local game store, open up my cards, build my decks outside of maybe a couple things I'd have to trade for, and just kind of hit the ground running. And but if you're someone who plays X Antibody now, you're looking and there's only a couple things you really need, you don't necessarily need Dexter or Gora. You potentially need Alpha Oriuken, the new rare Alpha, and Dorumon, maybe an option card or two. Like your deck gets like a handful of new additions. You're not adding every, like a whole new line as to where between 7 and 8. Um if you're playing yellow hybrid, you're swapping out a couple tamers, you're swapping out a couple option cards. Um you're not reinventing the wheel here. If you're playing Imperial Dramon, you get nothing. So you're fine. But if you're a blue player, you're probably switching to Metal Guru X, and it's a different story because now you have to dig up some old shit that you may or may not have.
Well, Imperial kind of does get something in the form of Magna X, and you could go like Imperial Magna.
Ah,
But I digress. Like it's still something.
yeah.
But point is, like, you're not replacing your entire deck all over
Hmm.
again, and I
Yeah.
think that's like the good point to be at, is where we're no longer replacing our decks, and some of decks just do hang around, and that's kind of cool.
Black War Greymon gets the other half of its engine, which is pretty cool. Galmon's, I think, one of my favorite card arts in the game's history so far. The alt art Galmon is just ridiculous looking. Um, and
But
you just get options. You get choices as opposed to right now a lot of decks, for the most part, like X Antibody, are just kind of running as many of the X Antibody cards outside of maybe the megas as they physically can, because they only have enough to run up one functional line.
and as the deck, or not as the deck, as the game expands, those options become more and varied, and that's just going to help the overall health of the game. So we're still entering like the second year of Digimon. It's still a relatively young game. 1 year, and we're only in about maybe 1,100 cards, no less than 15. uh 15K. Like the card pool is still small. We're still growing. And I think that the overall community is pretty good. And I think that the game is in a really solid spot for hitting the 2 year curse mark,
So
where this is usually make it or break it time.
yeah. Um, and with that, I think we'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you to anyone that stuck around to the end. Um, and goodbye.
Later.